Hello, and welcome to episode 219 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. We're here today with Peter Joseph, an American-born social critic and activist who has lectured around the world on the subject of cultural sustainability. Once deemed the herald of Occupy Wall Street for his tacit prediction of inevitable global uprisings against inequality and economic injustice, Peter's extensive media work has been translated into 130 languages and has been experienced by a quarter billion people. Working in concert with numerous nonprofit organizations and grassroots organizations, his core focus is on socioeconomic structures that undermine progress in the areas of ecological and social justice. Peter has been featured in numerous media outlets, many human rights movement. Currently resides in Los Angeles, California, and you can learn more about him at peterjoseph.info. Peter, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
Doing very well, Jordan. Thank you for having me on.
Great. So the first question I'd like to pose to you is, what are you currently doing, or what have you ever done to advance the public interest, and why?
Well, let's see. I produce socially conscious media. I guess I've been doing that for about 10 years, specifically around economics and the way we can alter our economy to improve public health and increase environmental stability. And in the process of that, I started a grassroots social movement called the Zeitgeist Movement, which has also been around for about 10 years and operates in about 40 countries or so with about 140 active chapters. And I'm also an author, which I think leads into this conversation. The new book, The New Human Rights Movement, attempts to address some very foundational problems with our social system and how the general public hasn't been able to really identify these root origins of many systemic public health and ecological problems. And that's pretty much what my journey is at the moment, to try to get some of these points across.
So, Peter, you have a very unique background, having been trained as a percussionist, having aspired to become a professional musician. Academically, you are not a public health professional or an economist with a PhD by training. So how is it that you began to create this multimedia phenomenon, this to be the intellectual father of the Occupy Wall Street movement, to become a movie producer and director, to have such strong opinions and such a articulated vision within the Zeitgeist movement, given your background as a musician?
Well, my background as a musician was mainly in youth. By the time I had to face the reality of working for a living, I realized that being a classical percussionist wasn't of a particular interest to me. I was more experimental and more ambitious in my work, so I decided that it would be better to keep my musical interest as a hobby and a kind of self-meditation. And I found myself, when I lived in New York City, after dropping out of school due to enormous amounts of debt as well, I started to reflect on things, and I found myself, like many artists do, in the advertising community. So at the time, in my naivety, I didn't think much of it. I didn't really analyze it from a sociological perspective. But slowly over time, being in advertising, it made me start to question the values of the culture and the allocations of money into to sectors that have very little fruitful outcomes and mainly serve to enrich a very small subculture of people. I was doing real estate advertising in New York City, where people would, these are people that would buy enormously expensive apartments and so on. And I got to be exposed to essentially the upper 1% culture in a way that I think a lot of people don't. At the same time, I went into Wall Street investing and was effectively a short-term trader for about 6 years. I did that simultaneously from my own account, and that led me on the journey of economics. So I dealt with professional traders. I learned from them. I did long, expensive mentorships. And I began to study social psychology and what's required for executing trading on a professional level. This is very short-term trading. But it led me into the subject of economics. And by the time I got done with this world, I was just so horrified by what the mechanism of the stock market and so on actually is, the way it's detached and decoupled from real, true economic production. And I think, to summarize briefly, those two issues put together really made me look at the social system and its core foundation, which is economics and, of course, market economics. And that's where the journey started. And since then, I've been completely self-taught, and I just continue, going where the information leads me.
So you've articulated an alternative vision for how our society might work. Clearly, there have been some parallels drawn between your ideas and the ideas, say, of a 19th century intellectual, Karl Marx, who also challenged the basic underlying capitalist foundations of Western civilization. What is it about your vision that I guess, could you please articulate your vision and then and in doing so, articulate some of the challenges and problems with our current system of social organization?
Okay, sure. Let me begin by just going back to the beginning of that question with the reference to Karl Marx, which is mostly a bad word when it comes to Western economic communities. And I think it's important to clarify where Marx came from in terms of his analysis of capitalism and the fact that his vision towards a solution was never actually realized. 99.9% of Marx's literature and analysis was about the capitalist system. It wasn't about actual solutions. And I think that's an important thing to point out because, as you might imagine, anytime you start talking about something that's not based on market economics, people quickly label you as a socialist or a communist or a Marxist. And I think that's a very unfair and just a stigmatized kind of reaction that needs to be moved past. In terms of the vision, basically, I'll put it this way. If you were to take all peer-reviewed literature of the past 50 to 70 years that relate to public health science, meaning what actually gives people the highest motivation, happiness, what actually creates longer lifespans, increases positive mental health, also improves social relations, reduce the propensity for war and conflict and gang violence and terrorism. Also, what creates cultural patterns that actually lead to a condition where people support their environment and live in coexistence with their environment as opposed to abusing the environment, which we see today. And you were to take all these studies that have been aggregate and you were to put them into a blender and you were to pump something out of it in return as far as what a more ideal social system would be, what I advocate is effectively that outcome, which has to do with certain core technical issues that underscore our economy, such as the advancement of technology, things that actually lead to improvements in public health while sidestepping the negative reactions, the negative externalities, for example, like pollution or poverty. Poverty is really a negative externality of the market system. And you put those things together and you end up with a completely different social structure. Some have different names for it. Some might call it a resource-based economy. I don't use that language anymore. I use it as a train of thought. And in the new human rights movement, by the fifth chapter, after going through a deep analysis of the flaws of the current system, along with what underlies actual social progress, you end up with effectively a need to move out of the competitive system, to a distinctly collaborative system, one that focuses effectively on automation as opposed to human labor, because unfortunately we're not going to be able to keep human labor in force. In fact, it's irresponsible for us to do so, given how efficient and safe new technologies are. Instead of a property system, we start to move to an access system. We see this phenomenon in the kind of renting, consumer-based renting stuff out there like Uber, and people have tool libraries and other types of residential sharing, which really isn't access, but it gives this sense that maybe if we shared things as opposed to having this individual ownership property value system, which is also highly required by the market economy because less consumption is never good for the market system. So everyone having one of everything is ideal for the market system, while in terms of nature, in terms of resource sustainability, obviously sharing is much more efficient. And we're starting to see that trend as well in the general community, in the kind of social entrepreneurship and green entrepreneurship. That trend is underlying. The third thing I'll mention is open source. We have a proprietary society where people sit in boardrooms and they come up with their ideas in competition effectively with other boardrooms, such as cell phone companies that are repeatedly making the same things over and over again, with tremendous waste involved, unfortunately, and a great deal of inefficiency, which is quite contradictory to the way most assume the market works. The efficiency that we do see looks good, but it's actually very poor efficiency in the entrepreneurial community when you compare to what it would mean to actually design holistically. And that's the beauty of open source today. If you look at statistics for open source, when you get community involvement, you actually have a much more rapid rate of efficiency increase of a given product design. And the fourth thing I'll mention is localization. We have globalization in the world today. It's been a necessary phenomenon, but unfortunately, because of this exploitation of labor and resources that are cheaper, across the world, it's very inefficient from a technical standpoint, even though it's efficient from a market standpoint. It produces enormous amounts of waste. The average American foodstuff, the average dinner plate of the average of Americans has traveled about 1,400 miles. Give that some thought. It's crazy from a sustainability standpoint. So localization is something I think will happen naturally anyway, but it's something that should be focused on because it will increase efficiency and reduce our environmental footprint. And the final thing, the fifth thing I'll mention, has to do with the move from price mechanism, what Ludwig von Mises held up as the ultimate necessity of a market economy, is that we can't understand feedback relationships, consumer preferences, and so on without price, and that has been holistically debunked by the fact that we can digitally connect just about every type of information now and create immense feedback, which has much more value. It's near real time. The Internet of Things and other technologies like that are enabling this, so we can achieve whole new levels of economic efficiency. And when you put those things together, you basically have a means to end poverty. You have a means to move away from all of the destructive social patterns that, while the market system has, of course, been productive, it's been required, it's an evolutionary staple, it had to happen, it's now a point we move out of this and try and create a new system that builds upon, again, the exact efficiency mechanisms that made the market system seem good to begin with.
Many exciting themes that you just raised there. Just to make it more concrete for our listeners, you speak about one thing that you spoke about was intellectual property and moving away from proprietary ownership of ideas to more open source ideas. I'd like to get a handle on what many of your ideas actually translate into in a concrete sense. So, for instance, you have this book, the Zeitgeist Movement, which sells for, I think, about $27. Is it available for free on the internet as open source text, or how would you exemplify this theory in our current capitalist society?
Well, there's two levels to it. Well, first of all, the Zeitgeist Movement's book, it's definitely not $27. It's the lowest possible value that Amazon lets you sell it at, and it's even cheaper on other distributors. And it is available for free. But that is an example of the movement just doing what it does to put out free information. That's always what we do. We don't sell anything. The only reason we have that for sale, just to be thorough with it, is just because people prefer to have a physical copy of such things. They don't necessarily want to read digitally. But it is available for free. But let's bear in mind that, we can't give concrete examples in the sense that our system is still based upon the sale of things. So we have to make transitions in open source where money relationships start to move away. And there are a number of ways that you could do that. I mean, if you think about royalty systems through open source, you could open source, for example, the design of an entire cell phone sector. So let's assume the entire cell phone industry decided to open source all of its cell phone designs and perhaps even the programming for the apps and so on. The community building into that, depending on how they do it, could be rewarded in a financial way. And that there's a way you could create a scheme for that. I briefly mentioned that in the book as well. But the point being, and this is really the issue, is that when you see the potential, then you compare it to what we're doing in the market system, and you see the loss of that potential because of the need for income, because of the need of survival through labor. You see the disconnect. You see the potential and then the lack thereof because of what we're doing today, which is why throughout the book I inch towards a final conclusion, and this is very controversial. It's very hard for people to get their head around, but all the evidence points to a non-market-based system. It doesn't mean it has to be 100%. There's always going to be a certain level of scarcity and a certain psychology that's been fostered that people get fearful about, and there'll be a certain type of rarity. But there's no reason to base our entire society on this when we're able to achieve effectively a post-scarcity abundance, and that's something else we can talk about.
Is a non-market-based system analogous to bartering?
No. If you take the attributes I mentioned, specifically, say, open source and digital feedback, and you put them together in a software context. And you thought about what people call participatory economics, where you could actually go in through open source and design a cell phone yourself. You can go and join a community online and design a car. The difference between this, the design issue is obvious enough because it's already being done. That's how Linux was created. But the difference is that you have to have the general society begin to share its core means of production. And this is where the term socialist could be thrown on this, but it's really just an issue of democratic participation. It really stuns me in a world that's striving to achieve civil and human rights, that's striving to achieve a basic equality, that everyone stops short of talking about economic equality. And economic equality
just to make this more concrete, so let's say it's a Saturday night and I'd like to go out to dinner with a friend in this non-market-based economy society, and I ordered dinner. What happens at the end of dinner? Do I get a check that I pay for?
No. If you were to be in a society that shared this type of value system, that shared this type of approach to economic efficiency, it would be like walking into any kind of environment where you take what you need and then you leave. And it's regulated through digital feedback, meaning that there's always a tracking system that knows what's going on. Now, if the efficiency is strong enough and the society actually is in favor of it, meaning you don't have this excess value system where people are groomed into this greedy mindset that is completely unsustainable, which is a direct consequence of our social psychology due to market incentives. I want to make that really clear. Now, people will hear that and they say, oh, that just seems like chaos. How do we know people won't abuse that system? People don't abuse many systems out there that are available in this type of manner through sharing, such as a library, such as the community presence where people are actually donating to poverty and helping people in a very conservative and effective way. There are numerous ways to think about this, and put it back to your concrete example. In this type of society, you have certain levels that would be free and certain levels that maybe would require credits because of certain levels of scarcity, but it's not based explicitly on scarcity. So it
sounds like. So right now there's still, there are concepts like a book exchange, like you mentioned, a library. It's slightly different. If I bring a bunch of books and I can take a bunch of books, and there, in D.C. at least, there are lots of neighborhood libraries that function in this way, like little birdhouses that people put in front of their houses. They call them neighborhood free libraries. I guess it sounds like if I go to a store and take what I need, and then I go to a restaurant and take what I need, then I guess in some way, eventually I'm able to contribute to the system as well. Which sounds, I guess, still to function similarly to the way our economy currently functions, except that you're replacing hard cash with trust. Is that essentially you're making a new currency out of trust, but you're still doing things and exchanging things, and you're still exchanging. So
there's a universal contributing factor to the efficiency of the economy, and that comes through this kind of systems engineering where people are contributing to design and to production, but they're doing so within this advanced state of high-level efficiency. It's difficult to explain because we're so used to the broken economic system with people and companies all over the world. There's very little design that happens through these channels of economic flow, as you call it. And in this type of system, if you were to really maximize our technical potential, you'd end up with a much smaller industrial design mechanism. Here's the analogy I use, which is going to sound pretty abstract, but the means of production is a term that's been used for years, often the division between capitalist and socialist societies. The means of production is said to be owned in socialist society by everyone, which has never existed in history, so we never had socialism in any true sense. And then in capitalist society, it's owned by private enterprise. What's happening today with the advancement of technology is that capital goods have become consumer goods, and and labor has become capital goods because machines and automation are doing so much for us now. They're increasing efficiency dramatically. And we also have consumer goods, which are basically can become capital goods because 3D printers and things of that nature are now becoming accessible to many. It's not difficult to foreshadow, even in the current economic system, that someone could have a printer in their home in the near future that can produce many things of a domestic nature, and people would not need to run out to Walmart and so on to purchase these things. This is fairly common speculation. And within that, you're able to basically, and here's my point, let me step back, excuse me. So imagine you have like a printer on your computer. That is a means of production. And you control that printer by what you're doing on the system, on your computer system, right? So you're controlling the means of production on that paper printer. Now imagine you scaled that out, and instead of just a simple paper printer, it's a 3D printer. And this printer has many different capacities that's been engineered to produce many things, as is going to be the case. And the whole of society is in contact with this design process and the printer itself, which eventually would be the industrial complex in the future society. So what I'm foreshadowing here is that you're going to have what's called more with less, or the zero marginal cost phenomenon. If you've read people like Jeremy Rifkin, he's very famous for this particular notion, which was originally put forward by Buckminster Fuller. And that is the fact that everything is going to get smaller and smaller and use less and less resources. It's also accompanied by things getting cheaper and cheaper, which is a good phenomenon, but it's never going to get cheap enough to really alleviate the kind of poverty that we're seeing.
Peter,
yeah.
let me interject for a minute.
Okay, sure.
So I'm looking for you to make again, as I mentioned earlier, a concrete example. Now, when you had and just because we're talking, so I know let's not compare you to Marx, but let's just take a separate example of an instance in history where people wanted change. So prior to the Bolshevik Revolution in the early 20th century in Russia, I'd heard that there were a bunch of scientists. They created their own little commune among the 40 of them or so that lived there just to test out the model. So as an analogy, are there any instances of you having created a fake sample prototype community based upon these principles? Because you have a lot of academic theory, it's very abstract. How would this actually look in real life? Have you ever demonstrated it? And as a corollary, let's say that you were the president, you were the Speaker of the House of Congress, and the President of the Senate as well. So let's say you're the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Let's say you had absolute totalitarian power in the United States to make your vision a reality. What would the United States look like? What laws would be passed? So there's a two-part question. One, do you have it currently in practice, and is it working? And please describe it. And part two, what would need to change? What laws would change? How, and what would America look like if this were to come to pass?
Well, for the first question, the best examples you could see would go back to indigenous cultures that had values that are in line with this. You had hunter-gatherer cultures that were not based on social stratification, that used gift-giving. They had a gift economy, and they shared things, and they didn't have social hierarchy or class. That was a long time ago, and those societies have been rubbed out. That is the best test of this. See, the problem is that what's required here is a kind of design initiation that utilizes a great amount of energy and time and resources to build a proper architecture. So the answer is really no on the level that I'm describing. It's inferential, but it doesn't mean that it's invalid. If you go back and look at all the studies that talk about human nature and evolutionary psychology, you go back again to all the public health research and ecological sustainable research about what's required to get humanity in line with nature, not to mention create a precondition that fosters the best public health, the inferential knowledge arrives at this basic model. And again, that's presented in great detail throughout the book. As far as the second question, in terms of American kind of laws and things that would shift it, that's an extremely complicated question because the majority of the laws in the books are based around property rights, either directly or by extension. So the first thing that would radically change in an access-based system, in a system where money is not the measure of anything, you actually contribute directly to production and design and so on, and then the fruits of that produce an abundance that is respected by the community because the community has learned that it can't live beyond its means. It's learned that we will self-destruct if we don't coexist. It's learned that we will destroy the entire planet, essentially the human species on the planet, if we don't align with nature. These are fundamental incentives that unfortunately are not incentivized by the current system. So I could go on a long spiel about the type of changes that would happen in the legal system, but what I think most important to say is that you'd see crime drop by 95%. Because, again, most of it's based on property crime. The neuroses of childhood deprivation would also be reduced because no one would be in poverty anymore. And most of the major things that cause social and psychopathology in human beings today are rooted in childhood abuse. Not to say that genetic predispositions are not there, but they're triggered by the abuse of children and deprivation of children. So,
well, let me contextualize your use of the word poverty. So there are many individuals, according to the United Nations, who in the year 2017 live on less than $1 a day. Now, is that poverty? Let me elaborate. These individuals, many of them, have never had any sort of economy. They've never had a dollar or dime or any sort of currency of any fashion in a traditional sense. They operate on a bartering system. They're subsistence farmers. They have cattle. They have peanuts. They farm. They do not purchase Western things. And they live from day to day, as they have for thousands of years, without any dollar. So they've lived for tens of thousands of years on less than $1 a day. In fact, on $0 a day. So are they in poverty?
Great question. I would divide poverty into relative and absolute. The absolute definition of poverty would be people that simply can't meet the most basic nutritional health. So when you have people that are chronically starving or are undergoing severe vitamin deficiencies that are caused by their lack of means, not necessarily genetic or other reasons why people could have those problems, but if they are starving, such as pretty much the effect of around 800 million people are in poverty today on the basis that they're not meeting most fundamental nutritional requirements, which means they basically live their entire lives sick by a fundamental measure. That's absolute poverty. Now, relative poverty that you speak of, I completely understand. And that's interesting because it's really an issue of social inclusion. And that is something that I think hasn't been talked about enough. In the United States, the poverty line is about $12,000 for an individual, which is astoundingly low and completely ridiculous. And what that really means, these people might have something like a refrigerator, which, of course, by relative standards, years ago, to have a refrigerator was a complete luxury.
But they could have access to cheap McDonald's food and, more importantly than anything, potable water without any kind of bacterium in them, which, again, in West Africa, in certain small villages or in Southeast Asia or in South America, you have individuals with lifespans half as long as those of those living beneath the federal poverty line in some of the poorest urban areas of the United States. So still, those in the deepest poverty in the United States, many of whom are objectively, they have access to luxuries. They can go to a library and access the internet for free and access to knowledge. They have access in some ways more than kings did a few centuries ago.
Yes, and that is a notable fact. That is the consequence of our amazing scientific and technological advancement. It has elevated the bar. But here's my point, though: relative poverty is an issue of social inclusion. So when you have, and this is the neuroses of social inequality that isn't talked about enough. When you have people that live in poverty by their measures against others, it creates conflict and neuroses. By the words of Dr. James Gilligan, the former head of the study at Harvard for violence, he denoted that the most core factor he saw that contributed to violence was social inequality, feelings of shame and inferiority that are created. Now, I completely agree. In fact, I love it. If you go back to indigenous cultures or areas of Mexico, they have much higher happiness indexes and far greater social capital and community than anybody in the United States, in any social relationship in the United States. That's because they don't experience that level of degrading poverty where they're able to look at others with these huge houses and access to things that they don't have. It demeans the will. Work by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett did an enormous body of research in their book, The Spirit Level, to talk about how the wealthy nations, those that have the most inequality in the first world nations, have the highest levels of cardiac disease, have the highest levels of violence. So there's a destabilizing thing that goes on, and that's why relative poverty is so important. Relative poverty is really an insult to humanity. It's not as simple. Our social nature is extremely powerful. It's not as simple as absolutes. And that's why relative poverty has to be dramatically reduced, if not ended. There's no reason to measure people economically, assuming even though we are all different and have different values on different levels, there's no reason to assume that just because we're all different and have different capacities that we deserve different levels of economic support. And that's one of the great myths that's perpetuated by capitalism.
In the interest of time and doing justice to what you've done, I do want to just briefly touch upon the Occupy Wall Street movement. You were once deemed the herald of the Occupy Wall Street movement. Now, to what extent, so please, could you elaborate on what was that discontent? How was it? Often it was difficult for commentators to understand exactly what the Occupy Wall Street movement was demanding. It was clear that they were angry and upset and were expressing emotions, but it was unclear what their actual legislative asks were. To some extent, according to some sources, can you elaborate on, were they trying to advocate for this abolition of, as you call it, relative poverty? How are you the herald of Occupy Wall Street, and what's its legacy?
Well, I was simply called that by a reporter once, and it kind of stuck because in a 2011 film I made, I depicted global uprisings, and that film was very popular. And then just a few months later, suddenly, pretty much the exact same thing happened that was depicted in the film, and that's pretty much the majority of that. I've spoken at both, New York and LA camps when they were there, and Occupy was a temper tantrum, and I think the critics of Occupy missed the importance of the symbolism of what they put forward. The demands were scattered. It was people angry about a lot of things, but mainly it was wealth inequality. Back to my prior point, if you have this type of stratification in society, you're going to have destabilization. And the next level of Occupy Wall Street might not be so nice. So it's a destructive force. It's a destructive force to have this. And Occupy just simply recognized that, had their temper tantrum, they were violently shut down by police. I've seen this footage, especially in L.A., and, this temper tantrum has been put aside, and Occupy is more of a meme now than anything else. Since that time, nothing's changed. In fact, things have gotten a whole lot worse. The problem with Occupy, along with a lot of these organizations, is they don't actually focus on a core solution that people can galvanize behind. That's why I wrote the book. I think if people galvanize behind the 5 economic shifts that I just described to you, the transition will happen naturally, where society itself will realize that we have to move away from the market mechanism to find new alignments with ourselves and nature. And I think it's just a matter of time, hopefully, that will happen.
So as we approach the end of this episode, I'd like to ask you a final 2-part question, which is to reflect on your work to advance the public interest with your vision. Why? What are your motivations? Why you? Why is it so important to do this now? And then what do you hope your legacy will be upon reaching the conclusion of your career? What will be the effect of your efforts to advance the public interest?
Well, as far as the second question, I don't really think in terms of legacy. I don't think in terms of memory of myself. I don't see myself that way. It's not an egoism for me. In terms of your first question, it's really an issue of a feeling of empathy. I mean, I think empathy is kind of pulled out of people as they grow in this society, because the social system really is in support of a true level of empathy. That's why people can walk over homeless in the street and really not think much of it. They just think that's just the way it is. They've been groomed into that indifference. And unfortunately for me, fortunately or unfortunately, when I look around the world, I have a very strong emotional sense. It's very hard for me to watch what happens, especially knowing that it can be changed. It's one thing to have a Malthusian worldview that this is just the way it is, and, population's the problem, and all this rhetoric that's been put forward. That really doesn't hold up to scrutiny. And it's another thing to actually see other people and feel their suffering, and to think about the future of your family, your friends' families, the next generation, and the general spiritual coexistence, I'll throw that word out there, with nature itself. Are we doing stewardship to our existence by living this way, or are we just a blight on the natural order? And unfortunately, as of now, I think it's the latter.
And that has been Peter Joseph, an American-born social critic and activist, once deemed the herald of Wall Street, who predicted global uprisings against inequality and injustice, the author of The New Human Rights Movement, and an intellectual who has a vision for a new way of structuring society. Peter speaks about how his vision, his philosophy is grounded in a profound sense of empathy and a profound sense of agency and volition. And the ability, he says, it's one thing to view a society that's been groomed into indifference and think that there is nothing that one can do about it. He refers to this as a Malthusian view, Malthus having predicted a population limit based on resources in the world. It's another thing to be an agent of change, to have agency in one's own society, community, and life. He speaks about ending poverty as a profound compassion that he expresses for humanity as a species and for all those who constitute its many different socioeconomic strata. He speaks about he differentiates between absolute and relative poverty, the latter being a degrading form of poverty that must be ended. Absolute poverty he defined as one where individuals cannot meet basic nutritional health. So in a sense, he would like to end both forms of poverty. He speaks about property rights being the basis of a capitalist system as also being simultaneously the basis of an inefficient and unjust system that is quickly depleting the resources of our society and of our planet. In a sense, Peter seeks to advance the public interest by creating a more equitable and compassionate world. And surely there aren't too many people who can disagree with that end objective. But as is the case with Public Interest Podcasts, guests do seek to advance the public interest and only differ upon what constitutes that public interest and how to get there. And for Peter, there's a clear 5-step platform for how to shift our social system. And you are welcome to read more at peterjoseph.info. So, Peter, I'd like to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Jordan. I really appreciate your time.